closet. So,
Here we go.
All right. Hi, Andy.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which sadly is still wrapped in a pandemic. The virus is doing what nature does and evolving, creating all kinds of additional ripples of risk as the vaccine, the emergence of vaccines, as some of our other discussions on here has shown, is just the first step. They have to get into people. And we're dealing now with all kinds of issues related to vaccine trust or vaccine hesitancy, depending on which label you want to put on it. And we've had probably a dozen conversations related to that. This is Thriving Online. This is the Monday sessions of my Earth Institute webcast, which I've been doing since coming up on a year. Oh my God, since last March.
Happy
to try
anniversary.
to navigate. I know it's happy. It is what it is. The idea here in my initiative at Columbia and what I'm doing every day is to try to make information and connection matter a little more. I have Julie Scelfo here today with us to talk about how to be media savvy. She and I both are New York Times veterans. I started there in 1995, left full-time 2009, and kept writing my .earth blog, which was similar to what we're talking about now. The blog was a way to interrogate complex questions, build relationships with readers. That's different than just telling a story. And Julie, I'm going to show a little bit of your work that you did at the Times, which was about the social environment very much, about labels and gender and percolating issues. You could define or describe your beat there as you saw it.
Well, when they brought me over to the Times, they asked me to work on the home section, which I was kind of surprised about because I didn't have a design background. But what always interested me is what the Times calls how we live stories, which sort of explore contemporary American society and looking at how we live. So I tried to do that as often as I could through the lens of the home environment, but I also looked at other situations. And you may or may not remember, but one of my first assignments when I got there is they launched a new blog that I wrote called The Green Home. And it lasted not even a year. They wanted me to try it. And we wrote about sort of being green in the home, which was very interesting. So that, there's so many subjects come up with that, particularly environmental issues and environmental contamination, an entire beat that still should be, rigorously covered.
But you like we came of age journalistically. You were at Newsweek. I was at the Times. I was at magazines before that. And it was all expository, telling a story, getting readers to read it, and then ideally hoping it might change the world a little bit in some way toward betterment, whether it's social, familial, environmental. And then it's, again, you navigated toward blogging. Here now with your media savvy project, you're navigating toward, you'll describe it in more depth, but to what can we do to improve the public and newsroom perceptions of the ways stories are made and received, rejected, and what the old method was really a sales pitch still. I mean, the front page thought, as I used to describe it, to get a story on the front page of the New York Times, you had to sell it internally in the newsroom, and then the newspaper sells it to the outside world. And a lot of that comes with a sort of oversimplification and the like. So just talk a little bit about your genesis. How did you migrate from Newsweek style reporting to what you were doing at the Times to what you're doing now?
Backing up, before I became a journalist, I actually started my life as a, young person in the 80s and 90s wanting to be a media critic. And even as a kid, I became aware of how disconnected sometimes the media about our society and the message it was sending were with the actual world. A certain type of beauty standard was always promoted. A certain type of person was always featured. And I didn't like this. So I designed my own major as an undergrad. And then I went and got a master's degree in something called media ecology, which might be one of the worst names ever. Everybody's like, what do you watch TV in the trees? But it was a wonderful idea founded in part by Neil Postman, who had built on the work of Marshall McLuhan in the 60s. And Neil was an English teacher, but what he noticed was that if you look at all of human history, starting at when there was cave painting, that every major transition in society, every major growth as a civilization was predicated on a change in how we communicate. And that every time you change the technology through which we communicate, whether it's going from an oral society to a written one, to a written society to having a printing press to having electronic communications, it doesn't just, it's not the old society plus the new technology, but the change is ecological. It changes everything about how we communicate, how we understand the world, and how we make meaning, how we view what's true, what's false, what's right, what's wrong. And so if you want to get at the sort of interconnections of society and how we communicate and build meaning, you really have to talk about the media that we use and our methods of communication. So, yes, when I was at Newsweek, I covered breaking news. I wrote society stories, which again, it's not Brooke Astor and Tease, but how we live. More women choosing to say single, more women riding motorcycles instead of on their own motorcycles instead of the backs of them, more people being diagnosed with autism, and then I covered a bunch of breaking news as well. So when I left Newsweek and went to the Times, it wasn't so much a shift in how I practiced journalism, but one of the things that I thought was really fascinating and heartbreaking was that a lot of the business challenges that I had seen Newsweek face, the New York Times was then facing as well. Because you have to remember, it was just in the last 20 years that we went from a national media landscape where we had many major daily papers in almost every American city. We had 3 major television networks, maybe 1 or 2 24-hour cable news networks, and 3 major news magazines. So every Monday morning, Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News would come out. Most people didn't realize this, but copies of the magazines were FedExed to the homes of all the morning show producers on Sunday. And on Monday morning, reporters from all those organizations would go on TV, talk about their stories. And it would kind of lead the week. If we did a really good job, we would beat you guys at the Times, and our story would be kind of ahead. And sometimes you guys would follow us. It was sort of a healthy competition. But once 24-hour news started doing what dailies did, the dailies started doing what the news magazines did. And writers like you would not only just report the facts, but create these beautiful narratives. And the news weeklies were left to say, what's our job? So the entire, information environment changed radically in the last 20 years, never mind the last 5 years with the introduction of social media, wireless internet, handheld devices that can access all of these social media programs and Facebook. So it's changed a lot. The industry of journalism has changed. The environment in which we're conducting our craft has changed. And then the environment that the audience lives in terms of the information they have access to has radically changed.
Yeah, when I started writing the blog at the New York Times when I was still a full-time reporter covering the environment, and the blog in 2007 felt like a way to fill in the gaps, to recognize the complexity in a story that was too often, when it got to the front page, to me, even my own stories felt over distilled, over simplified in ways that weren't really reflecting what you would actually need to do to, let's say, solve the global warming challenge. And so the blog was a way to get more dimensions around it, to build a conversation. And through that, I became kind of an internet optimist. This is 2007 through about 2010. I was writing about, I had a hashtag, the Noosphere, KNOWOSPHERE. And we're building this global connectedness, instant conversations. We can, fact checking, it can all build. And there were some little voices around 2010, some sort of more people dug in on the internet who say, well, yeah, but what about this? What about that? And then, more recent years, I felt, oh my God, this is much more hazardous terrain as well as a hopeful terrain. And that's why I ended up doing what I'm doing. So it's like, as you just said, that leads to such a list of, such a big to-do list. There's the to-do list for readers, for editors, for writers. That can almost be paralytic, but you kind of break it down in ways I think that are promising. Looking at your site, I'll show one of the.
Yeah, I mean, let's go through those. But before we do, I mean, one thing that I think is helpful, and one thing that we media ecologists do, is we recognize that, the technology isn't bad or good. And if you can sort of get rid of that language and recognize that every medium gives you some things and it takes certain things away. So every medium is better at communicating certain types of information and less good at communicating others. So a photograph, for example, is really great at communicating visual information, but it's not so great at giving you sound, right? It also freezes time. So you may see a photograph, but you really have no idea what happened in every moment leading up to the photograph or after. And if you keep that in mind when you're evaluating a photograph, it can help you be less susceptible to sort of believing narratives or ideas about the photograph that the photographer didn't necessarily put there, right? Just like a radio or podcast is really good at communicating audio information, but it's not so good at giving you a visual. So, when it comes to the internet or social media, I like to think of it the same way. I mean, social media, in particular, Twitter, for example, is done something incredibly powerful and valuable, which is it has blown up that old system that I just described of having these professional gatekeepers to tell you what's important. And it's because of social media that all kinds of stories that were completely neglected by mainstream media for so long were able to come out. It was because of social media that we were, without it, I don't think we could have had Black Lives Matter, or we couldn't have the Arab Spring. These are positive developments. But what social media takes away from us is you lose the gatekeepers. So now it's not just someone like you who's devoted 20 years to studying this subject and who applies a critical lens and thinks carefully about what information is valuable to the public, what isn't trustworthy. Anybody can post anything, including my 12-year-old son, who might just want to crack a joke and, amuse his friends. So
Right.
every technology gives us something and takes something away.
That is for sure. So let's dig in a little bit on some of the details of your method. And this is for one part of the grand challenge. I put it. This is not the entire thing. Hold on a second. So these are. Let me get rid of that. There we go. Sorry.
No. I mean, what I wanted to do is I thought long and hard about how to break this down into sort of pulling back the curtain for everyone on how to think more critically about media and do it in a really simple way. Now, before we go into it, I want to be clear that this doesn't cover everything. So one thing about mediated communication that we all need to keep in mind is that it's incomplete. No book is ever going to cover all of human history. No single movie is going to capture every narrative that exists. And this is not meant to be everything you should know about the media, but this is a place to start. These are some tools that anyone can think about. And it's followed by lots of links where I hope people will, go and get additional training.
Yeah, and the website is juliescelfo.com. I'll post it a second in the chat there. So the first thing, of course, is everything you're seeing is there for a reason. Anything crossing your screen didn't just magically pop up there. And knowing the motivation, knowing the context, like even the cultural context of the communicator. So just walk through those four
Sure.
steps.
So the first question I think it's really important to ask is what motivated this message? If you see a commercial on TV, you can be 100% certain that somebody is trying to sell you something. It is not there because of a public interest. On rare cases, there are public interest commercials, but the whole purpose of an advertisement is to sell you things. What I think a lot of people in the public don't know, because it's no longer taught in civics class, because we don't have civics class as much, is that journalists and news organizations are there to tell you what happened. And the people who work there are doing their best every day to let you know as best they can, and having confirmed to the best of their human ability what is actually happening in the world: who, what, when, where, why. So if you understand a little bit what motivated a message, that can help you determine how important this message is and whether you ought to pay attention to it. One thing that's happened in the media landscape, for which media companies are responsible, is I think that so many programs call themselves news programs, but they're not actually news. They don't have any professional journalists working there. They don't fact check the information. Someone like Tucker Carlson, who promotes himself as a news person, but says all kinds of things that are just verifiably not true. They're just completely false. So he is really an entertainer, but he calls himself news. And I think if you think critically about sort of what motivated the message, it can help you recognize, what is the starting point for each thing you see.
Yeah, and that's where even the media, basically what you just said is that even the media are mixing things up in ways that are really deceptive. I mean, not all media, not all organizations, but that line between opinion and fact. Sometimes you get these bizarre circumstances. Let me show you one from way back. My first New York Times byline, before I was employed at the Times, it was an op-ed during the Gulf War on the first Gulf War, 1991. Yeah, it was kind of a clever little op-ed. What if the oil just burned away? The Kuwaiti fires were burning, and so it was a piece about, like, suppose all the oil burned away. Would we still care about the Middle East? But look what was right next to it on the op-ed page. It was a Mobil Oil, ExxonMobil ad, and there was a guy. He's a famous public relations maestro who was working for Mobil Oil at the time, who was the one who invented the New York Times op-ed page ad. So that as you're looking at my stuff, you're also looking at the voice of the oil industry. That was a pretty mixed message. Is it unethical? Is it not? There's a big discussion underway right now in climate context of what newspapers should accept for advertising and not, as part of their ethical construct. So it's a weird landscape. And I guess what you're also saying is that somehow you have to build into your mental model, like taking a second or two to sort of absorb what's in front of you, step back maybe from what you're thinking.
That's right. I mean, going from, for millennia, the way humans communicated was in person and with one another. And so the information you got was in a certain context. What modern mass media have done, and certainly digital internet technology, is it has exploded context. You can see anything, anywhere, no matter space or time. And so, in order to have any kind of, rational thought, you have to be able to wrap your arms around what it is you're looking at. And so understanding what motivated a message, understanding the context of a message, journalist organizations operate by certain rules, entertainment shows operate by certain rules, the funny pages operate by certain rules. And if you can, wrap your mind around that, it's going to help you more easily make sense of what you're looking at.
What's your take? I hadn't thought about this until just now. What's your take on the New York Times ending its practice of having an ombudsman, sort of a reader's editor?
I think it's heartbreaking. I think that was a wonderful complement to the rest of the work that the Times is doing. I think that the function of a newspaper and a news organization is to educate the public. And I think having an ombudsman there to help explain things is certainly a valuable thing to the readers and also to the institution, because we're human, people make mistakes, and it's helpful to have that kind of feedback. But one of the things I really would love to see is news organizations undertake their own efforts at getting media savvy, which is really just my way of talking about media literacy. I'm not inventing anything new here. This has been around for decades. But you say media literacy and people roll their eyes, and it's a snooze word. It makes you want to take a nap. So these public editors, this is what they did in a way. They educated the public about what happened in the newsroom, because most people have no possible concept of, what goes into making a decision about a story or reporting a story. I had a family member. I wrote a story once at Newsweek about the lack of consortium laws in South Carolina. There had been laws on the books from the common law era that if your spouse cheated on you, you could sue the person that they had an affair with for compensation. And someone was like trying to bring these laws back and update them. And this relative of mine is like, what was your agenda with this story? And I'm like, what do you mean my agenda? And they were like, well, I don't understand your position. Do you think it's good? Do you think it's bad? What are you saying about infidelity? And I'm like, I have no opinion on this. Like, what I'm saying is my editor was like, find out what's happening in South Carolina with this law, and I did an update with a history of it, an update. So, we need someone, and hopefully the news organizations themselves can do this, but to explain what are the elements of a story? What is the difference between a feature and breaking news? What's the difference between the op-ed page or an editorial? Even working inside the building, it could be confusing sometimes.
That's true. And you also get, I'll just briefly reflect on one other issue that I saw at the Times, and we still see in the broader landscape, which is different sections of a newspaper don't talk to each other. In other words, the science editor doesn't vet a piece in real estate, such that you end up with a New York Times story. It's a cushy piece about booming high-rise towers in North Miami Beach. This is one I was really making my hair catch on fire in the Times a couple of years ago. It didn't mention sea level rise or the practical reality that it's fine to build a multimillionaire habitation on the coast you can protect, but all behind it is low income housing, et cetera. So just even having a sentence or something get into that story to give it the wider lens doesn't happen unless you have crosstalk. Another issue.
Well, right. But, that again, and that's a really beautiful segue, Andy, to the second, rule of media savvy that I suggested, which is, every time you get a piece of information, asking yourself, what information might I be missing? No one story is going to cover everything. And there's a reason that the Times and other news organizations have these different categories, right? There's a reason when you go into a university that you have different departments. They study, East Asian art over here and Italian culture there, and, physical sciences here. Now, the further along you get in any field of study, I think you begin to understand the interconnections between multiple fields, and hopefully at a high level, you begin to have these sort of collaborative relationships and conversations. But the vast majority of us are not experts in let me rephrase, no one is an expert in everything. And if you believe in expertise and you believe in the ability to specialize, I think there is some value in having these different specific areas of coverage. That also means that it's very frustrating to you as an environmental reporter when you see the real estate talking about the buildings and not talking about the impact on the earth. But at the same time, if the reader recognizes that this might not be the whole picture, and there's other information that they need, that gives them the tools to not sort of put too much weight on a single story. I mean, I'll give you another example. My husband used to be a federal prosecutor, and he had a really big case once that was covered by all the major New York dailies. And we looked at 4 different news stories about his case one morning, and all 4 of them contained an error, but a different error. And some of them were mistakes the reporter made. Some of them were assumptions the reporter made that they didn't know. And I knew all of the reporters involved. They didn't know me. They didn't know that we were married, or they didn't know me. But you can see, we're only human, and we're not perfect, and journalists make mistakes. But 100 years ago, when there were 100 daily papers in the New York Times, in the New York City, they would all cover the exact same story a different way. And most of them, maybe there were probably a couple that knew they were full of crap, but most of them believed they were covering the truth. So, you can't ignore the fact that humans are, the musician David Burns calls our minds, subjective laboratories. We all take in different information. We all prioritize different information, and that's the value of a robust, news landscape, is that you have multiple professionals working to get you as much information as possible.
So let's go to the, whoops, sorry.
And you can, I welcome your disagreements if you think anything I'm saying is not fair.
So far, I think we're pretty much in agreement. I love the news media. When I was at the New York Times, I did write increasingly on .earth, my blog, when I thought the norms of journalism were getting in the way of accurate portrayals of climate, what we know about climate and what you do about it. And I did this whole series on posts on what I call the pull of the front page thought, which gets back at that media ecology in the newsroom. You have a paper in a journal on sea ice in the Arctic. There's some element of it that the scientist has distilled in what they call an abstract, which is that pitch to his peers or her peers and to the public. And then that gets distilled into a news release from the National Science Foundation, which funded the work. And then that gets circulated to people like me. And then you have to, 3 p.m., the science editor used to go into that room at the Times or wherever else, and for the front page meeting, and you're competing with the latest politics, the latest stock market move, the latest sports stuff. And here's this, might be a pretty important development related to Arctic sea ice, but it's not going to get into the lens the public sees in the morning if it doesn't compete with those other things. So that landscape is a very tough one. And then the reader, as you say, has to deal with seeing, if they have the luxury of seeing multiple stories in the same thing, you see different takes. And I do think this idea of the news consumers developing skills that can allow them to at least know when they're being pulled in to embrace something because it's designed for that pull, then that feels like, if I could have some progress there, that feels like something that'd be a good thing to work on. And that's kind of partially what your media savvy project seems to be getting at. The hardest thing might be what you said about information that's missing.
Well, look, as I wrote, I did a piece for Yahoo News. It's on my website, but the answer here, there's no simple answer. This is a problem that requires all hands on deck, and news organizations are going to have to take a more active role in educating their readers about what they do. Readers are going to have to take more responsibility for what they click on and what they read. And I think government is going to have to take a more active role. It's been hiding because it doesn't want to deal with the very complex realities of what the social media platforms have created. But they're going to have to, the same way they had to create the FCC, in 1936. Radio so revolutionized our nation and the world that they were confronted with this reality of what do we do if you give one organization or just a couple organizations all of the power to communicate with millions of people. And so they're going to have to confront it. But really quick, in terms of eyeballs and in terms of attracting attention, everybody knows already how you get the most clicks. It's not magic. Busty blonde naked party, that's the headline. Right. We humans are wired to be interested in conflict, in drama, in anything that is scandalous. Gail Collins of the editorial page has written these incredible books about the gossip throughout history. Kevin Young, head of the Schomburg, wrote a great book a couple of years ago called Bunk that sort of looked at lies and misinformation throughout history. We are drawn to the most dramatic narrative. So sometimes that can be employed to good use, and skilled reporters can sort of make the most tedious and boring subject really interesting. That's one of the reasons why so many of us are grieving the loss of Sharon Begley, who died. She was of Stat News, and I worked with her at Newsweek. One of the most gifted science writers in the history of the world, and she could take any subject and just make it absolutely riveting and more importantly, understandable. But that is the challenge inherent in news. And that is also an inherent conflict with having a profit-driven newsroom, right? I mean, I think that's one of the reasons we're seeing so much great work come out of these new nonprofit newsrooms like the Marshall Project and ProPublica. Right. They're doing amazing work because they don't have to, their primary focus is not getting you to click. It's doing the best possible work.
Yeah, or although having worked at ProPublica, which I love, it's an amazing shop. A lot of our former friends from the Times there, but they also have their pull toward sometimes over distilling something in the sense of getting the consequential element in the foreground. It's very much gotcha. They need a gotcha frame, and that's totally appropriate on these close focus stories where someone has done something pernicious or corrupt or harmful. it gets tougher on a complicated issue like climate change, or think about the social justice issues that are complicated, that take generations to build. They don't fit so easily into that frame sometimes. There was something I wanted to show, something here. There is a group called Solutions Journalism Network. It's Tina Rosenberg and Bornstein, David Bornstein, and others who they commissioned this piece a couple of years ago by Amanda Ripley on how do we as journalists complicate the narrative. And she actually, Amanda Ripley, went to at Columbia University. There's a difficult conversations laboratory, really exciting place. She learned some methods from them and from people who do mediation, like mediating disputes, on how to interview people in a different way. So you're not just interviewing for the quote. And I guarantee you and I have spent time interviewing someone where you're basically waiting for that little distilled nugget that unfortunately might actually oversimplify or crystallize the question or the person's view, as opposed to asking questions that are digging deeper. And she describes these methods. I think it's fantastic. But I think, how do you sell that? How do you sell that to a reader? And that's part of what she lays out in this story. I guess, in a next steps way, I'd love to hear from you about where this goes from here. As you say, it's pretty, I wouldn't say easy. It's possible to break down the motivation, who profits, etc. But you have to have the motivation to do that. And we're all, in lives that are, we want a Paul Krugman or someone else to kind of guide us through the morass. So what's your plan? Where do you go from here with that idea?
So I'm waiting for my magic wand to show up, and so I can just fix everything. But I have a wonderful partner, Heidi Boisvert, who is a brain researcher, and she looks at the neurobiological effects of media. And not only are we sort of in an emergency situation in terms of civic society and our democracy, as we witnessed at the Capitol a couple of weeks ago, but Rand Corporation for several years has been calling it truth decay. The Stanford Historians Education Group said that in 2016 that this is a perilous time for civic society because after surveying tens of thousands of middle, high school, college students, they found that few of these people were able to differentiate different types of quality information. So my thinking about this is that there's several things that need to happen. So as I already said, I think news organizations need to do a better job of educating their readers, but we are going to have to begin to teaching media literacy in schools, because one of the things that has happened with social media, it's the word doom scrolling now exists. It has become so common for people to be so overwhelmed and almost rendered paralyzed by all the bad news in the world. Because of the volume of information, our bodies, our brains did not evolve to be able to process that number of different problems, conflicts, narratives, and that onslaught of constant emotional upheaval. No person can do that. And we have, as a society, been accelerating and accelerating and accelerating the volume of information that we intake. And it's up to us now, to put a lid on it. I mean, there was a study years ago about potato chip consumption, where they found if you gave people a bowl of potato chips, and if you increased the size of the bowl and it had the same amount of potato chips, we ate more because there was a bigger bowl. And it's just like when you look at nutrition and you go back and you look at, FDA guidelines, or not FDA, who does the, FDA, from 25 years ago, and they talk about serving sizes. And then you find out, the average size of a drink back then was 6 ounces or 8 ounces. And now people are buying like a 72-ounce big gulp. And you understand, why we have an obesity problem. So we have a media problem. And the only way I think we're going to address it is if we start to give children at a very young age sort of bake in these critical thinking tools, so they're not as overtly affected by media, and also that we have some stronger regulation. I mean, it's a mess. It's going to be very difficult for the government to deal with, but the FCC has no teeth right now. They're not addressing it. They haven't updated the laws in years, and they're going to have to.
No, if there is a public sphere, if there's a commons, typically those are arenas where regulation is most understood to be needed. It used to be the fairness doctrine was there because there was a finite set of frequencies you could broadcast at, and so it's a public resource. The internet grew out of federal inventiveness, federally funded inventiveness, all the way back through the Cold War and interesting science projects, and it doesn't have that yet. There you see these big tensions in that right now about who's on or off Twitter. Big questions here. And I'm glad you guys are foregrounding this stuff. Heidi seems interesting. I'm just looking at her Twitter page.
We're trying to. I mean, it's challenging because, as you said, Andy, the first front page problem, if I'm able to convince everybody in the world to get media savvy and put myself out of business, what I'm trying to do is not make any money here, or it's not to sell something. But I guess that's not true. I want to sell the idea that to stay human in this crazy information environment, that we all need to better equip ourselves to manage how we get information. So, the third Get Media Savvy tool that I put in my TED Talk, and it's up on the screen, is sort of whose perspective am I getting? And, recognizing that there are multiple and maybe infinite perspectives is something that I think professional journalists have failed to do. And I think it's something that readers and news consumers need to think about, because, again, no one story is going to give you everything. But there is a reason that so many people are coming forward now. There's a reason why we're seeing so much celebration of Black excellence and Black girl magic and Black media, because think of how many years that perspective was just completely omitted and ignored in mainstream media. When I was at Newsweek, the library would circulate magazines back when magazines were a bigger part of our, media diet. And you could sign up for the ones you wanted to get. And I used to read every week or month when they came out, multiple Black social magazines, women's magazines, business magazines. And I remember being shocked at how few other people in the building were reading them. Why weren't they interested? This is an important one of multiple parts of American society, just like Latina magazine, just like these other things. But there isn't always the widespread interest in people who are not like us. So definitely newsrooms have been too white for too long. Editors and publishers put this challenge together, I think in '96, that they wanted, within 20 years, that the staff in newsroom to reflect the American public in terms of gender, in terms of ethnic diversity. And when they got to the 20-year mark, they were like, oops, we're nowhere near this. Let's give it another 20 years. And it still hasn't happened. And, as a result of that, I think we have more bifurcated media now, where you have, great projects, but it's separate still, and they're not reflective of the entirety of American society. So, whose perspective am I getting is, a question that if someone is reading a story about high rises in Miami Beach, and they recognize that this is a story about the realtor's perspective, this is a story about a commercial interest, but they're not getting an environmental perspective, at least then there's a asterisk in their head, and they realize, if I want to know about the environmental implications, I need to go also read something else, or I need to also go check out Andy's blog, and vice versa. The environmental media maybe isn't always talking about the economic implications. So it's a really challenging, all of these issues in society are complex, but the only way to really equip ourselves to think critically about them is to be thoughtful about the information we consume.
And the one angle that I find keeps coming up, not just in terms of the internet, but in terms of how we react to conflict or react to someone we see as the other, or information that's inconvenient, is the internal work. It's not, there's the list of the 4 things to do to dissect the anatomy of the message, but the thing that seems often hardest, and this has come up in some of my conversations on this show, is what's the internal work that has to be done to recognize your own propensities to be tribal, to be to only accept signals that are convenient. And that if anything feels like it's the bigger challenge. I was actually thinking of playing, there was this magical moment where a friend of mine who's a Black songwriter, I say that for specific reasons because he's worked hard in the BLM context too, being out there as a songwriter and a messenger. And he was at this last year up in upstate New York, in Cobleskill. He went to a BLM rally on the village green, and there was also a MAGA rally at the same time. And he had this moment with a MAGA protester where Reggie, he describes the work, the internal work. He started to feel his blood rising, his own emotions getting in the foreground. And he said, oh, he pulled back and he said to the guy, Reggie paused and he said, hi, my name is Reggie. And the other guy said, my name is Joe. And they started to talk. But it was all that internal part that was like the hard part. So I think that feels like a big chunk of what's got to happen.
I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I moonlight as a coach with the Op-Ed Project, which is this wonderful organization.
Sure.
It's been around for 10 years, and it was started by a journalist in response to a study that came out that showed that 95% of the expert voices on op-ed pages were male. And at first she was like, oh, those op-ed page editors, they must be so sexist. But then she found out at the news organization where she worked that 95% of the pitches that they got were from men. And so actually the gender, the sex identity of people who were pitching was not what was determining it. And she realized if she could just increase the number of pitches that women submitted, there could be a real impact on whose voices get heard. So she started offering these sort of training programs for women. And over the years, it's expanded. And now there's a Public Voices Fellowship at about a dozen universities around the country. But I'm working with a personality psychologist at Morehouse right now. And he's writing about how the real freedom work to be done right now, especially in white people, is to better understand how they define themselves. Because so much of how, this is Claudia Rankine's work at the Racial Imaginary, but so much of how white people have defined themselves is by saying, well, they're not Black. Well, what is that? And what is that about? And it's the same thing that James Baldwin tried to teach us about, sort of about identity and where identity comes from. And that is a big part, that was a big part of media ecology, actually, is recognizing these universal human truths, no matter where you are in the world, no matter what decade you're born in, what tribe you belong to, what you look like. All humans need to make meaning, and they need to figure out who they are, where they belong, what is my purpose? There's sort of these universal questions, and all societies throughout time have tried to answer those questions in certain ways. That's what religion is the answer to, right? Who am I? You're a child of God. What is my purpose? To serve God. Where am I going? You're going to heaven, or maybe to hell. So if you're able to sort of ask these questions, and be comfortable reflecting on your own ways of forming beliefs, then those same critical thinking tools allow you to evaluate any kind of information that comes in, whether we're talking about news or other teachings that you get in school, from your families, wherever.
That's so interesting what you said about the Op-Ed Project, and it's great to hear that you're advising there or in some capacity, because what you just demonstrated was the value of taking, you could call it an ecosystem approach, or you can call it systems thinking. My wife teaches systems thinking to teachers and how to teach sustainability. And it's essentially saying, well, what actually is the problem with op-ed pages? And if it's access, then what can you do to facilitate access in communities that are underrepresented? That's a fantastic insight into how to think ecologically or systemically about these things.
I mean,
That's
it's
great.
one part of it, and but no matter who is writing for an op-ed page, there are other problems with op-ed pages, right? So
Oh, for sure.
especially, I mean, a very basic one, I think, is that they need to be labeled clearly. You know, I argued privately with someone in the publisher's office at the New York Times a few years ago when they, you know, launched a new opinion feature and they weren't labeling it that way. And this person said, well, you know, our readers are very smart. They know the Times, they know what this is. And I said, you know, respectfully, they are smart and they're busy and they have jobs and families and they don't have time to, you know, figure out where things are printed on the print page so that when they see it online, you know, they understand what section it is. I mean, another example of that, you know, and I raised this to people at the Times, but during the last election, I was personally shocked when I went to the New York Times homepage and there was a banner horizontal ad for Hillary Clinton for president underneath the New York Times title and above all of our news stories. I had never seen an advertisement in that placement before, and certainly not a political one. And when I inquired about it, you know, the response from the business folks was, oh, you know, we can't control that. It's where they sell the ads. You know, it's an algorithm. We didn't put it there. And I said, well, how can you not think then that every person in the world who sees this newspaper is going to believe that the entire institution, you know, has this bias? And maybe it does have this bias. That's a whole other conversation. But, you know, how information is received is an important component of recognizing how humans make meaning. It's not just how information is given.
More great insights. The one thing that I had pitched to the Times at certain points was I guess this gets at the value of conversation or discourse as opposed to story or message, and which I think is a big part of success going forward is enabling that moment that Reggie Harris had to say, "I'm Reggie. Who are you?" And the op-ed space is so brittle and it's so distilled, you know, 750 words, that's it, you know, boom. And they never encouraged, except when they had comments, they never really encouraged reasoned discourse around those questions. The op-eds are just thrown into the pool, get a lot of views, move on to the next one. So it created ripples and waves and sometimes tidal waves. And I thought, well, why aren't we fostering that conversation around these things? I called it room for agreement. Can we have a section? The Times had room for debate, you remember?
I was just going to say, I remember room for debate, but I love this idea of room for agreement. Again, you know, this is the work that like George Lakoff did. That's so important. You know, think if you're familiar with his work, you know, he's sort of, you know, if you define things a certain way, it changes people's perspective on how they interpret it. So just by calling it room for agreement, we might more readily set ourselves up for agreement and success than room for debate. You know, debate has conflict, so maybe that would attract more viewers, and that's why they went with that. You know,
yeah. And to me, it's about the structure of problems. Most of the grand issues are not yes, no, right, wrong. They're iterative, and their true dimensions only become revealed through interrogation and sort of crosstalk. Climate, justice, you name it. And so I think that Lakoff lesson is really important. I'm overdue to try to get him on the show because if you're defining the framework in which the telescope that you're looking at the problem with, if that's constraining even the nature of what you think of as the challenge, then you're really missing the mark on the grand issues of our time. Vaccination, all these public health. What is public health? It's kind of like, what is a safe climate? And there's no simple answers. You could have 1,000 op-eds and not really change anything, as opposed to creating a forum, perhaps, where you can start to come out at the end of each day with some directionality that was different than the day before. I don't know if that feels meritorious or
no, it totally does. But I think it also helps explain this unusual situation that we're in right now, where there's so much conflict in society and people believing such, you know, radically different realities. And that is, for so long, expertise was really siloed, right? I mean, I like to think of it, if you go down the hall in the university, you know, if you're a poli-sci major and they're in there doing organic chemistry and someone's in advanced Japanese, I mean, you wouldn't walk in that room and expect to be able to have a conversation at the same level as people who specialize in that information. And social media took everybody out of those silos. And it's wonderful because you can engage directly with experts in a certain field. You can ask questions, you can respond to them. But what's bad about it is that people who don't have the same depth of knowledge might hear something and be upset by it or be confused by it or angry. You know, all kinds of emotional responses happen. And then you have a conflict that didn't even exist before. So I think that's something that happens a lot around gender. I think that's something that happens a lot around race. I don't know about climate change, but I do know that there's a lot of people who, you know, especially in a moment where the disparity in wealth in this country is greater than it was in feudal times, there's a reason that people only want to talk about or only looking through the lens of their own personal welfare. They don't care what happens to the planet in 20 years. And it's hard to have that conversation. So I imagine, you know, part of what you do is figuring out how to have meaningful conversations. You know, the more people who can understand the complexities of what's happening in the environment, the more people we can enlist in being good stewards of the environment, the better. But it's a challenge, right? How do you take all these complexities and make it as accessible as possible?
Yeah. And again, the dimensions, you know, you just made me think of another aspect of this, which is when we cover an issue or when it becomes a news topic, it ends up being framed mostly through politics. Like right now, you're seeing the climate problem being framed as what's Biden doing that's different than Trump, as opposed to backing up and saying, what is the actual climate problem? And why are we polarized? What are the aspects of polarization that lead us to differ? And then what can we do to cut through that? And John Sutter, who was a CNN opinion videographer for a while, he's now working on a really cool project. He in 2015, ahead of the Paris Climate Agreement, he went to the place in America where Yale and some others had surveyed, and they found it was the most skeptical county in America on global warming. Like this Woodward County, Oklahoma, was ground zero for, nah, that's all a bunch of hooey. And he interviewed this guy who worked for an oil company. And if you just read the first part of what he said, ultimately God controls the environment, you would go, okay, we're not getting anywhere here. But during the interview, he also said, you know, we have half of our roof is covered with solar panels and we want to get off the grid entirely. And that's like mind blowing. When you listen to this interview, it's really amazing. And it was part of a series of just stand-up discussions of climate and energy. And this gets to so many of the points you've been making, which is if you're stuck in your frame, climate denier or climate believer, and you're not open to finding areas of concordance, you would miss that. Wow, even in Oklahoma, even in the oil patch, even in Woodward County, there are people who want to get off the grid, which is what I want because of climate. His reasoning is completely different. He's libertarian. If I can make it myself, why do I have to pay utility? And what that leads to, of course, is this uncomfortable reality. He's also a guy who would never vote for Hillary. I'm sure I would almost guarantee if we called him up, he voted for Trump. But there it is. It's like he's getting off the grid. So definition of problem, you know, different motivations are fine toward a goal you find you can get common ground on. It feels like that practice or that, whether you're a reporter or just talking to someone who, if you care about wearing a mask and she's dismissive, then where do you go with that? Some of these are probably you're not going to get very far, but some of them you can.
You know, one of my favorite podcasts is called Snap Judgment. And Glenn Washington, the host, talks about being as far off the news as you can be. It's a storytelling podcast, and they just tell great stories. And so much is illuminated about our human condition and American history, just listening to all of these different stories, and so many perspectives that you just, you know, you can't even imagine that they exist, you know, until you hear them. But you're right. I mean, I think that this will never be solved in the sense that, again, no one story, no one book, no one news article can capture all the different perspectives. But if you have that in the back of your mind that, you know, this is just a piece of communication, then that makes you more equipped to make, discerning judgments about what you consume, what's most important, whether you stake your whole life on it. Here's a question about getting high school teachers to teach media savvy when they face objections. It's a great question. I think that as an American society, we are behind the times. I mean, there are a lot of schools that already do this. I interviewed a teenager in Santa Fe, New Mexico recently, who was so incredibly media savvy. I mean, light years ahead of me, because she said, we have no choice. We can't survive as a person in society now unless we know how to discern different types of media. She blew my mind. And there are a lot of schools that do this. But, the Canadians started doing this after Marshall McLuhan in the 60s, recognized how society was rocked so much by television. And television was really the beginning of an era in which images became more powerful than anything else. It's not the only time in history that has happened. Before we had literacy, churches used to do these big stained glasses as a way of communicating these powerful stories to many, many more people than they could just individually. So images have existed throughout history. But once you have television and you have this world where you need to look a certain way, I mean, look at my background. It's kind of hopefully a little more professional looking than the actual closet I'm sitting in. I put on a little makeup today because, if I looked as, slobby as I mostly have been through this pandemic, I just wouldn't have the same credibility. And if you teach children these lessons from a very young age, even just taking them to the Museum of Television and Radio and letting them be on camera, letting them understand that being on camera doesn't mean that the person is magical, as, Susan Sontag tried to teach us all about photographs when she wrote her landmark essay. Having those lessons sort of baked into what you do makes a big difference. And I think teachers across the board are facing all of these challenges now of children who are growing up in a digital environment where we are already losing some of the gains, I think, that we made during the Enlightenment as a society of literate people. So attention spans are shorter. I mean, I'm struggling. I have kids at home during the pandemic with remote learning. My 15-year-old's doing great, but my 10-year-old loves to go on YouTube in the middle of class. And so what happens if they have 5 years of TikTok before they're 10 years old, and their attention spans, that used to be short already, but were challenged to get longer by reading, are now getting shorter and shorter. So teachers want to address this. Educators want to address this. It all goes hand in hand with learning and what kind of a society we're going to have.
So there's much to be done here. That was a great question. Also, Joanne McGarry, who's a frequent commenter and watcher here from Northern California, she, where is it here? Oh no, can't find it. She asked she said, are there lessons in what Jon Stewart, not Jon Stewart, but she did say Jon Stewart, but I'm saying, I think about comedy and other trusted messengers who've gotten into the mix here. She talks about Jon Stewart was a comedian who gave us news. And obviously last week tonight, John Oliver, I'm kind of craving John Oliver's take when he gets back on the air sometime this month on the whole game something, because I know he'll just deconstruct it in ways that will be more impactful for me than much of what I've seen in the news too. So are there other novel messengers here that can get in the mix besides the traditional purveyors of information?
Well, again, Andy, I would say that, all media gives us something and all media takes something away. So I heard a lovely story on NPR yesterday, my friend Susan sent, about a 9-year-old who started his own subscription newspaper in his neighborhood to raise money for food banks. And he wants the readers to be children, so he's including puzzles and mazes. And then once a week, he hand delivers the newspaper on his bike around the neighborhood. He's raised over $1,000. Really sweet story. And so all different types of people are purveyors of information to one another. Families, societies, communities, televisions, television programs, online programs. We're all contributing to building the world and what we believe. And so the advantage in getting information from sources other than professionals is you might hear different things, and you might have access to ideas or perspectives that you wouldn't have gotten. But the downside of that, as anyone who has gotten a forward from their great aunt or uncle with an amazing picture about the ocean parting seas, is that, nobody is vetting that information. And so you might get some of your time wasted with completely artificial images that are digitally constructed, and it might be a distraction from more important information. So, Neil Postman's landmark book in the 80s was Amusing Ourselves to Death. And he identified this problem that, we wanted to have fun and we wanted to amuse ourselves. And we do this so much that we give our attention to things that amuse us. Now, to the credit of John Oliver and Jon Stewart and all these guys, who can ever forget Jon Stewart's SmackDown with Tucker Carlson, where, Carlson argued that they were both doing the same thing. And Jon Stewart is like, but I'm on the Comedy Channel, you're purporting to be news. And so therein lies the rub, right? It's sort of like recognizing what the purpose is. This goes back to my question, sort of what is the purpose of the communication? And my very last question that I have, to ask, because I think it's important, is who profits? And, society has just become so dominated by consumer culture. And that's not the only definer of society. My opinions on capitalism I think are irrelevant. I think, capitalism does some good things and capitalism does some bad things. But it's clear that does not need to be the only operating system by which we run this country. And most good journalism in this country has existed because of the benevolence of wealthy patrons. I am very lucky. I have been a beneficiary of the Graham family, who own Newsweek, and of the Sulzbergers, who own the New York Times. And for the most part, these were patrons who stayed out of the newsmaking and allowed journalists to pursue what they thought was interesting. But the Times went public, and the model of profit making and the desire for profit may be sometimes at odds with speaking the truth and getting to the bottom of the facts. And so, I put that question there not because I think everybody should be should walk around, skeptical of everything. But I do think it's worth examining where you get your news from. What is the profit model there? What is the economic model on which they work? And it just ties you back to the other questions. What motivated this message? Like, I don't think the teachers working in our children's school are there because they are looking to exploit as much profit as they can from your child. Like, I think they want to teach your children, and that's why they're there. So anyway, just some tips.
Yeah. This is great. Well, Julie Scelfo, I'd love to have you back on sometime, perhaps with your partner in this adventure you're on. JulieScelfo.com is the way to find you. I love what you're working at here, the idea of ecosystem of knowledge and response, or lack of response, looking for what's missing along with what's there. Great insights here today. So this is it for this hour on the Thriving Online Monday sessions of my Sustain What broadcast from the Earth Institute at Columbia University. Sustain What is a global online conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration. The Zoom mode we've been in since the middle of the last century. It's been set back by this pandemic, but you can be sure we're going to get back into Zoom mode. A prime focus of this project is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment. It's the one Earth system changing faster than the actual environment. And as Julie laid out here pretty compellingly, it's an undiscovered frontier for the most part. There's lots of work to be done, which feels overwhelming, but also means everyone can do something in your day-to-day life, or whether you're an editor or a news consumer. This project is produced as part of my work building Columbia University's Earth Institute initiative on communication and sustainability, trying every day to make information and connectivity matter a little bit more. As soon as we're done, share the link you've been watching on with friends in circles far and wide. Look at that scrolling bar at the bottom, distracting you, perhaps, but now it'll be useful. When you look back, you can see ways to get in touch with me for feedback and on shows coming up. So come up with ideas yourself and tune in every week. You'll see the sessions we're doing going forward. Thanks so much for being here today, Julie.
Thank you.
And
I mean, I think what you're doing is so important too. And as a parent, it's been interesting to see how we shape messages about the environment for children in ways that don't terrify them. It's a hard balance to strike.
that's a whole frontier, not to mention public health and the pandemic getting past this. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Tune in again. We'll do more.